Welcome to the Tic-Tective Podcast, a program of the Bay Area Lyme Foundation, where our mission is to make Lyme disease easy to diagnose and simple to cure. I'm your host, Dana Parrish, and I'm the co-author of the book Chronic, and I sit on the advisory board of Bay Area Lyme Foundation. This program offers insightful interviews with scientists, clinicians, patients, and other interesting people. We're a nonprofit based in Silicon Valley, and thanks to a generous grant that covers 100% of our overhead, all of your donations go directly to our research and prevention programs. For more information about Lyme disease, please visit us at bayarealyme.org. Dr. David Perlmutter is a board-certified neurologist and a 6-time New York Times bestselling author. He serves on the board of directors and is a fellow of the American College of Nutrition. And he currently serves as the director of neuroscience research at Bryan Therapeutics. And I have to say, he is one of my all-time favorites, a huge hero and inspiration. And I'm so excited for you to hear this podcast today. Welcome, David. I'm so happy to see you again. It's been forever.
I'm delighted to spend time with you again. This is great.
Last time we saw each other, it was because you were so generously promoting our book, Chronic, my book with Dr. Phillips, and you had us on your podcast. And
that's right.
That made our book shoot right up Amazon charts. I know you
wonderful.
know that.
That's the reason we did it, because it was a wonderful book.
Thank you.
You know, the focus of that book, I think, was really, really important. A lot of people don't recognize that we still live in a time when we can be threatened by various inputs, including microbial issues. So very timely.
What are you seeing environmentally in the world, and what's happening to us? What are the effects of all the different environmental assaults that we're facing right now?
I think you just have to keep your ear open and listen to even what's hitting the regular news. This is well beyond reading the medical journals.
Yeah.
That said, in end of 2023, BMJ published an incredible study showing that globally, between the years 1990 and 2019, rates of cancer in younger people, meaning less than 50 years of age, have gone up close to 79%. That's very worrisome. And and these are cancers of the gastrointestinal system, including obviously the colorectal area, but also pancreas, and in women, breast cancer. And these numbers are skyrocketing. These tumors are aggressive, and younger people are dying from this sudden upsurge globally in these cancers. And I was actually, this morning, went for a run, and I was thinking about it in the context of a study that was published yesterday that related risk for pancreatic cancer to exposure to a couple of things like mancozeb, and I'll define that in a moment, and glyphosate. Let me get to the glyphosate first of all. So pancreatic cancer that we're seeing everywhere, hearing about, Prince Charles, now King Charles, et cetera. And we ask ourselves why. This study revealed that a history of exposure to glyphosate, or chronic low-grade exposure to glyphosate, is a risk for pancreatic cancer. And as I'm listening to this podcast, watching this fellow spray the Roundup around the bushes at my neighbor's house. I mean, it's so obvious, so clear that we are just, have blinders on, and we're not really paying attention to what's going on. Let me tell you, the other part of that story was the discussion about the relationship of something called mancozeb. Well, what in the world is that crazy chemical?
Right.
Well, it turns out that mancozeb, I've known about for quite some time, because mancozeb is a chemical that is used to create Parkinson's in laboratory animals like rodents and primates. It selectively attacks part of the brain. But this research demonstrated that, in fact, any exposure to mancozeb is a risk factor for pancreatic cancer, which is almost uniformly fatal, at least as things stand today. Well, mancozeb is a fungicide that is promoted for use on our vegetable gardens. I went on to online and saw that I could order it, and there it was in all its splendor in a package, and on the package were some greens, as if you're supposed to spray it on your greens and be exposed to this. It's, man is the only animal who will befoul his own nest, Gregory Bateson. And we are befouling our own nest. I mean, beyond that, um, we're seeing horrendous consequences now of exposure to particulate matter in the atmosphere. We call the dangerous ones anyway, PM 2.5. They're 2.5 microns in size. And these particles, which we're getting from air pollution, from indoor air fresheners, candles, you name it, incense, but certainly a lot more exposure now because of our higher rates of forest fires. And we are inhaling these particles. They're getting in throughout the entire body, including into the brain, and they're powerfully inflammatory and challenging to the immune system as well. So we are seeing relationships then of exposure to these PM 2.5s and risk for degenerative conditions related to the brain, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, certainly immune-related things, and cancer and coronary artery disease as well. Beyond that, gee, where do I stop? Are the microplastics. And, this is certainly a threat to which we are all exposed. One recent study was really quite interesting, looked at the plaque taken out of carotid arteries in a fairly large group of individuals and evaluated the plaque that came out of the carotid artery, the main artery going into the brain, and stratified that plaque as to whether it contained a lot or not so much of the microplastics. So if it had a lot of microplastics, compare that over the course of the next several years to people who had plaque and had very little microplastics in the plaque. What they found was that the people who had higher levels of microplastics in their plaque had a dramatic fourfold increased risk of a major cardiac event in the ensuing, I think it was 3 years. So, we've got to do our very, very best to avoid these things. How do we avoid them? Well, where do you begin? You avoid the microplastics by not drinking out of plastic containers. Yes, we were concerned about the bisphenol A, et cetera, but it's a big source of microplastics as well. Drink out of stainless steel, drink out of glass.
Yeah.
This thing is lined in stainless and keeps drinks cold for 2 days. Amazing.
Do you
Not going to tell
filter
you the
your
brand.
home water? Where do you get your water
Well,
from?
we have two. We have RO water, and we also order water from Mountain Valley.
Yeah.
And in the 5-gallon, I hope I never break one glass container.
Yeah.
The day will
They're
come,
so
I just
heavy.
know they're heavy. 7 times, well, not that, how much is water? It's 8 pounds a gallon. So
Yeah.
40 pounds in glass, and always carrying it over the floor, and a hard floor. Anyway, keep my fingers crossed. But I think that's really important. So there are some things that we can do. And as it relates to the PM 2.5, a lot of the earlier research done in Toronto actually looked at risks for dementia in people in comparison to their proximity to a major roadway. Those who lived closer to the roadway and were exposed more to these PM 2.5s had higher risk of dementia moving forward. But
What
I
do we
think
do about New York City? Like, I live in New York. What do I have tons of HEPA filters going at all times just because I learned
exactly what
so
you
much
need to
about
do.
the air. Okay.
So that plus, the N95 mask
Yeah.
works really well. And these days, hey, you can get away with wearing it and not feel so socially ostracized
Yeah.
because, people think you might be sick or whatever, you're caring for a loved one. But that is effective. And, the problem is that people say, oh, it's a forest fire. That's just the smoke bust out the marshmallows. Well, it's not a forest fire. I mean, let's be clear. Things are burning that are putting horrendously dangerous chemicals into the atmosphere. So
Yes.
we are inhaling particulate matter of chemicals that have become combusted. And, the gases of the combustion of really dangerous stuff, insulation, siding, all the kinds of things in homes and businesses that are being destroyed by fires. And, we looked at what happened last year in northeastern Canada, where some 27 million acres of land were burned up, beating the previous record by about 8 million acres. And the prediction for this year is it's going to be much worse because it's much drier, particularly in British Columbia, where the snowpack is about 60% less than normal. because it's been so darn dry and warm. So
Wow.
that said, it doesn't bode well for fires in the Pacific Northwest and the British Columbia region as well. And, smoke does not respect borders, that's for sure. We saw a huge influx of smoke and dangerous PM 2.5s into the Midwest, into the Northeast, into New York. During the fires last year, we have to just think back of what New York City looked like for
It was
a
terrifying.
week at a time. Yeah, it was terrifying. So if I could, one last thing I'll say, because it sounds like I'm painting a really grim picture, and I am. That the University of Colorado put out yesterday its annual Atlantic tropical storm prediction, indicating that the number of named storms, hurricanes, and severe storms, Cat 4 and 5, will be at a level unprecedented this coming year. They've never predicted this many storms and this many powerful storms
Wow.
because of some changes with El Nino finally relaxing, being replaced by La Nina, and the incredible heat being generated already in the Atlantic basin. So, gosh, I sound very pessimistic about things right now. And unfortunately, I'm happy, but I am pessimistic. I really
Yeah.
think that we need to ratchet up what we can do to protect ourselves. You mentioned having HEPA filters at home. I am all in. That's a brilliant idea. We live on a boat for 4 months, and we have a big HEPA filter in the main cabin when we're underway, and we move it into our bedroom. And last year, we were closed the windows, HEPA filter on, and had radar on just to see where we were
Wow.
because of smoke. And what does the future look like as it relates to these things? Who knows?
The question is always, what can we do if we've been exposed to these things? Just take glyphosate, for example, and the fungicide that you mentioned. Is there anything we can do? I know the word detox is sort of a controversial thing to say, but is there anything we can do to help mitigate the damage and also of microplastics?
Well, let's first talk about the toxins. By and large, what these toxins do,
Mm,
they are mitochondrial toxins. And
yeah.
so they do their damage, especially interestingly as it relates to Parkinson's disease, by damaging the mitochondria of various cells in the body. And sometimes they're a unique population of mitochondria that are damaged, but by and large, that's where the issues occur. And as a consequence, the relationship then between exposure to things like glyphosate and mancozeb and other types of threatening chemicals that are related to risk of cancer comes from mitochondrial damage in the immune system. So we know that our macrophage cells, for example, a very important part of the immune system for scavenging damaged cells, et cetera, were threatening cells that may be labeled by our T cells and B cells. But
Mhm.
that said, a lot of the ability that these cells have to deal with cancer is metabolically quite demanding. These cells have a high level of metabolic demand to do the work that they do to help our bodies both survey and also rid themselves of malignant cells. So that said, we've got to do everything we can to upregulate or to increase mitochondrial function. And so maybe I'll leave it at that. We can unpack that if you like.
Yeah, I'm very interested to hear how we do that.
Well, there are a lot of things to do. So, a lot of research is looking at a certain pathway called the mTOR pathway in
Yes.
terms of giving us an opportunity to enhance mitochondrial function. When we stimulate another pathway, and that would be using things like rapamycin. Frankly, there are lots of studies that are underway looking at rapamycin for a whole spectrum of issues, including preservation of ovarian function in women,
Hmm.
as a treatment for Parkinson's. And the other things we should certainly unpack are other inroads to helping mitochondria rid themselves of defective parts, or having cells rid themselves of defective mitochondria. We call that mitophagy. And that then amplifies our ability to make more mitochondria, which we call mitochondrial biogenesis. And really anything that goes through a particular pathway called the AMPK pathway, AMP kinase pathway, tends to do that, tends to act as an agent that will then allow us to have better, more functional mitochondria. And one of the most powerful inroads to this pathway is physical exercise. That's a powerful stimulator of the AMP kinase pathway. We want it to be active, so we reduce our uric acid. We'll probably get to that later on. We know that berberine activates it, so does a drug called metformin. A lot of mitophagy-related drugs that are in development. So I think everything is really geared at catering the mitochondria, giving the nutrients that are important like coenzyme Q10 and creatine, and really reduce our exposure so we stop threatening our mitochondria. Because again, people get the fact that, well, mitochondria is the energizer of the cell. We need it so cells can do their work. But in the age of immunometabolism, we really need to focus on how in cells of the immune system are really relevant and how compromised mitochondrial function affects immune function. And we really have to broaden the scope on what we mean by immune function. When I say immunity, everybody's thinking, well, the ability to fight COVID or the cold or whatever.
Yeah.
But there's a lot more going on, especially as it relates to the brain, that immune cells in the brain are constantly on a surveillance mode and are nurturing neurons, are ridding the brain of misfolded proteins like beta amyloid, and are nurturing the connections of one brain cell to the next called the synapse. That's when these brain cells called microglia are doing their job. When their mitochondrial function has been compromised, then they can no longer nurture cells. Beta amyloid accumulates, phosphorylated tau protein accumulates, and instead of being kind to your synapses, these cells now destroy synapses. And that's about the last thing we want to have. We know that loss of synapses, we now call them synaptopathies, that's a central mechanism in the Alzheimer's brain, in the schizophrenic brain.
Interesting.
So we have to recognize that it's not just the neurons that should be the focus of our attention, it's the relationship of one neuron to the next that is nurtured by these immune cells when they are amplified in their function by having good mitochondria. When their mitochondria are not functioning appropriately, they switch, they become the evil twin. So it's really the difference between the angel and the assassin in the very same cell. This cell can be an angel and can be tending the garden and doing great things in your brain and body, macrophages. But when their mitochondria aren't up to the task, then they become the assassin and they threaten health. They threaten our ability to scavenge and get rid of cancer cells. And how we threaten our mitochondria has to do with our lifestyle choices. So that when we're not getting enough sleep, when we're eating ultra-processed foods, for example, these are threats to our mitochondrial function and therefore threats to our immune system. And I think in addition to toxic exposure, may well also help explain why we are seeing this sudden incredible rise in incidence of cancer in younger people.
Yeah, it's like a perfect storm. There's so much happening at once. When you were talking about brain synapses and sort of explaining the relationship to neurodegeneration, it made me think about psilocybin. Do you have any thoughts on psilocybin and similar drugs?
Well, I do. I mean, here we're talking about the pathology of disconnection. And in the human body, connectivity is job one. Everything is generally aware of what everything else is doing. And as it relates to my area of interest, the brain, this connectivity is central. And to get to your question, what has been shown is that exposure to some types of hallucinogens, in fact, amplifies connectivity, amplifies not only neurogenesis, the creation of new neurons, who wouldn't want that, but actually synaptogenesis as well, the formation of brain cell connectivity.
You mentioned berberine and metformin, and I wanted to go back to that because I am frequently asked whether these two drugs, I know one is a supplement and one is a pharmaceutical, but whether they are equal in terms of their benefit and if berberine is safer.
I would say likely berberine is significantly safer, but are they equal? No. I think that the activity of metformin in terms of stimulating AMP kinase is far more active and predictable, and beyond that, doing other good things in the physiology. But we've transitioned now away from that to a lot of focus on modulating physiology and metabolism via the use of these new drugs, the weight loss drugs that are GLP-1 agonists. The banner drug, of course, was Ozempic, but now there are multiple drugs out there. And I have to say that we don't know what the long-term consequences are going to be. We don't know what is the risk of pancreatic dysfunction. We certainly, there's a slight increased risk of pancreatitis, possibly pancreatic cancer. Don't know the answer to that. But there is seemingly some amazing metabolic upsides that relate not just to weight loss and blood sugar control, but to brain health, brain function. One study came out 2 days ago showing that treating Parkinson's patients, well, let me set this up a little bit better. What led into this study was it was noted that diabetic patients who were given these GLP-1 drugs in comparison to diabetic patients who were given insulin, that the risk of developing Parkinson's was dramatically reduced in those getting these GLP-1 agonists. Why
Wow.
might that be? We'll get there in just a moment. But there's an interventional trial that was completed back in 2016, showed not just a slowing of cognitive decline in Alzheimer's, but actual improvement. At least
Ozempic?
using, no, it was a different drug that was subsequently taken off the market, again, because of the risk of pancreatitis was pretty high with that drug, not available anymore. But it shows to Goya that this GLP-1 antagonism, or agonist rather, activating GLP-1 receptors does some pretty powerful things in human physiology. So even in the brain, we know that these microglia cells that I've been talking about have GLP-1 receptors on them that modulates their functionality. Might that be why the new study that just came out demonstrated that in Parkinson's patients, I think it was a 3-year study, that while the placebo group had a pretty a predicted decline in motor function as rated on what's called the Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale, those who were taking the GLP-1 drug did not. In fact, they had virtually no decline in their motor functionality. So what is it telling us? Well, again, it's showing us that yet again, these drugs are powerfully effective in modulating mitochondrial activity. So, Katie bar the door in terms of where you're going to see application of GLP-1 agonists moving forward. But it's very, very exciting. And I'm not advocating here that everybody jumps on Ozempic or, Wegovy or something like that at this point. But I am suggesting that we have to keep our eyes on this incredible information.
Yeah.
And understand that, there are things that we can do to increase GLP-1 production within our bodies.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
Yeah, like eating foods that are, for example, high in good fats, high in fiber to slow blood sugar rising. We know that the sugar allulose, which does not stimulate blood sugar rise, actually enhances how insulin works. Allulose is a dramatic amplifier of the release of GLP-1 from the L cells in the small intestine. So we're going to hear a lot more about allulose moving forward, that's for sure.
Can we get allulose yet?
I just had some before I went live with you. Yeah, you can. There's a brand I use called RX Sugar.
Okay.
And I put it in my coffee in the morning, and it is remarkable because it helps curb your appetite, and it's powerfully effective in increasing the release of GLP-1. You can demonstrate in yourself a teaspoon of RX sugar and then have a higher carbohydrate meal. And if you're wearing a continuous glucose monitor, you'll see that the glucose spike is blunted. It's
That's so
dramatic.
crazy.
Yeah,
Wow.
and it's over the counter, and it tastes exactly like sugar, not quite as sweet. So in a recipe, 70% is sweet as sugar. So if you like sweet things, you have to add more. But you'd be surprised how much we depend on things that are really sweet, and you can back down a little bit. But gosh, I'm now able to have iced tea And ice cream. Can you imagine? My wife made ice cream the other day using as a sweetener allulose, and we had company over, and they were a little, they said, we're having dinner at the Perlmutters and you're serving us ice cream. Then we told them, we said it's made with allulose.
I've heard you talk about other sweeteners and they're not so beneficial, some of the other artificial stuff. So this is kind of an exciting new development.
It's very, very exciting because it plays into this whole GLP-1 science, body of science that's developing that I think is revolutionary. I mean, I've never seen anything quite like this. And again, going to watch the literature very, very closely to see how it develops, mostly in terms of any potential development of side effects moving forward. With so many people now taking these drugs, I think if there's a downside, it's going to be pretty obvious pretty soon. But I know a lot of people who are using these drugs who are not trying to lose weight, but recognizing the upsides in terms of metabolism.
Well, they're very compelling. I realize we're not talking about rapamycin, but even seeing the effect of that on a 15-year-old dog has been very eye-opening for me and has got me very curious about all these other things.
And there's a lot of really compelling data as it relates to rapamycin as well, in terms of reestablishing a youthful immune response as it might relate to immunizations in humans. There are a lot of reasons to consider it. And when we first heard that this was a potential way of regulating metabolism and immune function, et cetera, everybody, in my circle, at my stage in life, kind of pushed back because we all remember the days of rapamycin being the go-to drug to give to people who were recipients of organ transplants to suppress the immune system. We're thinking, gee whiz, who wants to do that? And it turns out that, number one, and most importantly, the dosages used are vastly different, that the dosage used in people, and it is available, people who are using rapamycin, I hate to call it anti-aging, but to improve their metabolism, generally being cycled, periods on and periods off. And, I've not heard of any significant issues. There is the risk of, I think probably one of the most common is oral ulcers, so ulcers in your mouth, which I guess would go away if you simply stopped it. But hey, I mean, I know of quite a few people who are actively using rapamycin and even talking about it.
What are they seeing in themselves?
This is all going to be subjective. These are not controlled studies. There are studies in humans, as a matter of fact, that have been published and some that are ongoing right now that will provide objective parameters in terms of what humans can expect. But I've not heard anything truly overwhelming. I think how can you distance in these n's of one from a placebo? But having said that, there are placebo-controlled trials in humans of rapamycin showing certain changes taking place as it relates, for example, to immunity. So I think we're early in being able to have a good assessment of what that might be doing. But there's some pretty smart people that are using it, and I've been tempted. I have not done it, but I've been tempted.
So there's been some new controversy about intermittent fasting, whether it's dangerous. I know how some of these food lobbies can work.
The food lobbies are in big trouble.
Yeah.
And they are especially threatened by the widespread utilization of these GLP-1 drugs, that people are eating less. And I think when they, there's nothing they're going to be able to do about that, but they can create confusion as it relates to intermittent fasting. I think that, to be fair, the intermittent fasting claims might have been a little overblown. I do like the notion of hormesis, however, meaning stressing your body a little bit. And I do it probably every day in terms of waiting till I eat. For me, I feel better. I like to protract that period of not eating from supper time till maybe noon the next day. And fasting is, in my opinion, or what I think is meaningful, is from time to time, figure out what that means, that you don't eat for a day or two or three.
Yeah.
And that's really the way that you begin to amplify these endogenous mechanisms that have really salubrious outflow in terms of rerouting metabolism for the better. It's all about metabolism, isn't it? I mean, this is where we are now. Immunometabolism. Who knew?
Did you think this when you were writing Grain Brain?
Oh, no. It was very clear when I wrote Grain Brain that elevated blood sugar and insulin resistance were really huge players as related to the destiny of the brain. And that's why, basically, I mean, that's the central thesis of that book.
Yeah.
I will say that we really didn't know why. Over the years, it became clear that glycation of proteins increased inflammation. Inflammation was certainly not a good thing to have in the brain. That higher levels of these glycated products increased reactive oxygen species formation. That was bad for our mitochondria. These things developed over time. And in fact, there is a graph that I included in Grain Brain that demonstrates risk for brain shrinkage correlated to hemoglobin A1C, and it begins at like 5.8. And if, well, I'm keeping my A1C below 7, I'm fine because I'm taking this drug.
Right.
No, that's not reality. But the new developments, I think, that are so exciting are really stem from our understanding of these immune cells in the brain, the microglia, that these microglia cells, which are so important for maintenance of neurons and synapses, as I spoke about earlier, or when their metabolism is threatened, then these cells threaten neurons and synapses, that they're very sensitive to things like insulin and blood sugar levels, that there are receptors on these cells that bind, for example, beta amyloid. And when they bind beta amyloid, they shift from being friend to being foe. They shift from being angel to being assassin. The very same cell undergoes this morphological and physiological change. So it really relates then, this understanding that our lifestyle choices are incredibly relevant. I will say that Alzheimer's, by and large, is not a genetic issue. So people say, well, like 23% of people in America, I have the APOE4 gene, and therefore I'm at risk, I'm going to get Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
Well, we used to say that. Now even people who are APOE4, we say, oh gosh, their risk has increased 12-fold. We really recognize that lifestyle factors are hugely relevant in terms of that determination and transcend whether you carry the APOE4 gene allele or not. So, I have APOE3 and 3, not as good as 2-3, but carrying 3-3 means that I'm at lower risk. Does that mean that I can slack off and, gain some weight, let my blood pressure go up, use mouthwash, et cetera? No, it doesn't, because it's not really the genes anymore. It's the
What do you
lifestyle.
mean about the mouthwash?
I knew that would get you, didn't it? It's an interesting thing to unpack. The metabolism of the body, and importantly, the brain, which is, when I check last, part of the body, depends upon a couple of things: blood flow and the way that the cells are able to utilize fuel. That defines metabolism, meaning glucose by and large as it relates to the brain. So insulin has to work to keep the blood glucose getting into the cells, and there has to be blood supply to that organ. It turns out that the key regulator for both of those is a gas called nitric oxide, NO. And let me sidestep for just a moment, because an interesting study was published a couple years back looking at the insurance records of around 7 million individuals in the United Kingdom, searching for people who were taking whatever drug it was to determine which drugs might reduce risk of Alzheimer's. And what they identified was one drug was associated with a 69% reduced risk of developing Alzheimer's. It's a drug called sildenafil. And many people have probably heard of the popular name of sildenafil. It's Viagra. Viagra works, a phosphodiesterase inhibitor, works by increasing available nitric oxide, NO. What does nitric oxide do? In the case of Viagra, it increases blood flow, in this case for erectile dysfunction. But it does so throughout the body, including the brain. So individuals, mostly men, but some women, taking Viagra experienced about close to a 70% risk reduction of development of Alzheimer's. Well, that means we should be paying attention to this nitric oxide stuff, because it's important in powering the cell via and getting fuel to the cell with blood supply. Blood vessels open up as they do when Viagra is used, when nitric oxide is doing its job. Now, about 50% of the nitric oxide in your body depends upon something called nitrite. That's the ground material, the substance from which it is made. Nitrite in the body is made when we eat foods containing nitrate. Nitrate, when it makes contact with bacteria living on the top of the tongue, is converted to nitrite that your body uses to make nitric oxide.
Huh.
Now, two studies are important that came out in the past 3 years. One looked at what is the risk of diabetes in people using mouthwash twice or more times daily. Now, this mouthwash, chlorhexidine, is a powerful, kills 99% of germs. You've seen the commercials,
Sure.
including those bacteria in your mouth that are converting your food-based nitrate into nitrite, therefore, theoretically, reducing nitric oxide availability in your body, and as such, setting the stage for you to be diabetic. Risk of diabetes was increased about 48% in those individuals who use mouthwash twice or more times daily.
Wow.
Risk of hypertension was increased close to 100%. It allows us then to focus on the upside. Well, then what can we do to increase nitric oxide? It's so important. And it means eating foods that are rich in nitrate, like beets, for example. You know, there are so many products on the market for athletes that are based upon increasing their nitric oxide blood flow to their muscles that are derived from beets. Even beets is in the name of some of these products. And there's good reason for that, because beets are high in nitrates. So, you know, the idea of, we know the gut bacteria really does a lot of wonderful things. We could probably meet at another time and talk about that. But now we're focusing on the role of the oral microbiome and catering to the oral microbiome, not threatening it with fluoride in toothpaste and mouthwashes that are designed to kill germs. We don't want to do that. Sure, we want to have good oral hygiene. We should be flossing, using a water pick, brushing our teeth.
Yeah.
But it's really just fascinating to consider what we might be able to do by increasing nitric oxide, increasing blood flow throughout the body, including the brain, as well as the function of insulin. And that segues really very well to something that destroys nitric oxide, that really reduces availability of nitric oxide in the human body in a very potent way. We've got to all be aware of it. And it
Okay.
is something called uric acid.
Yeah.
And we've talked about it in the context, I think you and I have talked about it before, in the
Mhm.
context of gout, but we now recognize that uric acid is a central player in regulating metabolism. When it is elevated, we compromise nitric oxide that raises the blood sugar, it raises the blood pressure, and, you know, does some pretty damaging things. And it may be why there is such a strong relationship between elevation of uric acid and risk for dementia, elevation of uric acid and risk for coronary artery disease and stroke, because of what it does with respect to metabolism. You know, one interesting study was published that indicated that, you know, we have this notion of what's called asymptomatic hyperuricemia. Means, well, you've got high uric acid, but you don't have gout. End of story. So you're asymptomatic. And, you know, people who have elevation of, in this study, who had elevation of their uric acid but didn't have gout, had about a 17% increased risk of having high blood pressure. That makes perfect sense. Of a 23% increased risk of what's called dyslipidemia, problems with their blood fats. Really very important. You
How
know,
do we
others,
get uric acid? Is it from sugars, or how are we producing it?
wonderful. I'm glad you asked that question. And the answer is yes, you are correct. We were all taught that uric acid elevation for the gout patient, they need to be on a low purine diet, right? That's what we were all told. That if you still go to the major clinics' websites, cut back on your purines. Well, what are purines? Purines are the breakdown products of DNA and RNA. So stuff from inside the nucleus of the cells of the foods that you eat and your body as well, broken down to form purines that is metabolized through an enzyme called xanthine oxidase to form uric acid. And that's the teaching, wasn't it? And but what we now recognize, and it's been recognized for an awful long time, is that the sugar fructose is really the main driver of uric acid production in our modern times. That uric acid levels have almost doubled since the 1920s, really in lockstep with our sugar consumption. Table sugar is 50% fructose, 50% glucose, 50% fructose. So by virtue of our consumption of ever increasing amounts of fructose, because high fructose corn syrup is very sweet and very cheap, so it goes in everything. But because of that, we are driving this survival mechanism, which is uric acid, which served us in our ancestry when we didn't have food and would allow us during times of fructose exposure, in other words, the fall when fruit was ripe, it would allow us to make fat and store fat and lock it up and to increase sugar production through what's called gluconeogenesis in the liver, so we could avoid what's called predation and starvation. Predation means we could avoid getting eaten by predators, and starvation is what it is. So we would make more body fat. We would use less energy because high levels of uric acid threaten mitochondrial function as a survival mechanism, so we wouldn't use all of our calorie resources.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting that uric acid paves the way for fat storage as a caloric buffer to keep you alive. I mean, if you want to have hummingbirds in your backyard, what do you put out there?
Sugar water.
Sugar, exactly, because hummingbirds make fat when they consume your sugar water.
Yeah.
That then is allowing them to make these epic 1,000, 2,000-mile journeys because they become really fat. I mean, it's hard to imagine a hummingbird being fat, but that's how they store their calories, as does any animal that wants to store calories for the long run. The camel has a hump that allows it not to drink water for 3 weeks. Well, why so? If you look inside the hump, is that a big igloo cooler full of water? No, it's not. It's full of fat. That fat is then metabolized through, over time, that produces two things: carbon dioxide and what we call physiological water. So it's the burning of fat that allows the camel and the whale, for example. The whale doesn't stop along the way looking for freshwater springs in the bottom of the ocean. They make fat. They make a lot of fat, and then they use it to make physiological water.
Can you turn any of these metabolic diseases around?
Oh, absolutely.
Is it ever too late? Do you ever just say,
nope?
Okay, what can we do to prevent them? And what can we do if we feel like we're sort of sliding into that range to improve our odds?
Well, I think that the techniques to prevent are very similar to the techniques to reverse. I think this was wonderfully demonstrated by Dr. Sarah Hallberg, who in her 2 studies of type 2 diabetic individuals was pretty much able to get a lot of them off of medication, or at least dramatically reduce their medications, and by changing basically their diets, by putting them on a ketogenic diet, reestablishing insulin functionality, insulin sensitivity, lowering blood glucose, and overall, making these individuals healthy again. Therefore, we ask ourselves, well, how did they get into that trouble in the first place? And I think it really a lot has to do with diet, by eating these ultra-processed foods that are so prevalent in our society. And let's also mention the idea that not getting enough restorative sleep is a powerful threat to the function of insulin in human physiology.
Yeah. What about keto versus paleo? This is another question I am asked frequently. When you wrote Grain Brain, I have a very close friend who was the first person I knew to bring it to my attention right when it came out. She had a son who got PANS, and he was psychotic. Well, she followed the principles in your book. She even wrote you a fan letter, and you were so lovely in responding to her. But it completely reversed his psychosis. She did paleo with him. He had 6 amazing years until he got another immune hit and relapsed. It was so powerful to watch that.
The premise underlying paleo is to bring environment and evolution into harmony. When we first look at the work of Dr. Lauren Cordain, he made it very clear that his belief, and I agree with him, that many of the chronic degenerative diseases that characterize our modern time are a consequence of the mismatch of environment and evolution. In other words, that our genome codes for our physiology and that we are threatening that functionality based on the foods that we are exposing ourselves to now, the likes of which our genome has never seen before. So our genome, our DNA was refined over countless generations to function as well as it could to keep us healthy and able to reproduce, given a fixed set of circumstances: food, lifestyle, exercise, sleep, all the things that our ancestors did. Suddenly, we've turned the tables in the blink of an eye. In 0.005% of the time that Homo has been walking the planet in terms of at least the food that we are eating. The big shift, of course, began, let's say, 14,000 years ago with the advent of agriculture, which really, I think, dramatically changed, turned the tables in terms of human physiology. Our brains became smaller. Lots of things happened, and we began to see in the fossil record dentition changes in the fossil record of the human microbiome. Yes, we can determine the microbiome in fossilized poop, oddly enough, but this was a huge shift in nutrition. We were hunter-gatherers, and I think that what Dr. Cordain wanted to get across was if we can live a life, including food, that is more representative of what we've always eaten, except for 0.005% of our time on the planet. So virtually the entire time we've been here, that we'll be healthier.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
My first publication on this environmental evolutionary mismatch came out in the Miami Herald in 1971, where I wrote an editorial talking about how our ability to adapt over time isn't going to allow us to adapt to our rapidly changing environment. That's pretty much what I wrote. I was 15 when I wrote that, but I was already becoming concerned about what I was seeing going on around us. Having said that, the so-called keto diet, I think is much more scientifically defined. I mean, you can't really define a paleo diet. We don't really know what our ancestors exactly ate. And, to eat closer to nature, I think, is kind of the push there. And, we're not saying people need to go out and hunt and gather.
Sure.
In the strictest sense. A keto diet is one that achieves a scientific benchmark, and that is the production of ketones in your blood. And how one goes about that, there are many ways to do that. You can use supplements. You can supplement with MCT oil, for example, and at the same time dramatically cut back on your consumption of carbs and to a lesser extent protein. Or you can fast. Various ways to get there, and then demonstrate by one means or another that you're actually in ketosis via a blood test, urine evaluation, or even now there's a breath test that you can take that tends to indicate whether you're in ketosis or not. So what Dr. Hallberg did was put people on a very strict ketogenic, meaning generating ketone bodies in the blood, and was able to demonstrate really beautiful findings as it related to type 2 diabetes, which frankly is an epidemic in the entire planet at this time.
Yeah. Is there any downside? Again, keto, been hearing controversy, but you and I both know how sometimes these controversies are generated by political forces. What's going on?
I think that I would not recommend full-on ketogenic diet at all times.
Okay.
And I think that there is some benefit to complex carbohydrates in the diet in terms of fiber. One thing that I see quite commonly in people going full-on keto is that they don't have dietary fiber to any significant degree. They're eating a lot of meat and a lot of fat, and they don't get fiber. So, I think that there are some significant microbiome changes that are seen, and they're well characterized in people on a full-on ketogenic diet. So be careful of dietary fiber. You can supplement that with products that will not affect your ability to get into ketosis.
Yep.
It might be easier for an individual to get into ketosis if he or she takes an MCT oil product. So just things to think about. Some people get constipated, some people get diarrhea, depending on their types of fat that they're consuming. Some people get, at the beginning of going into ketosis, when they're not fully adapted, in other words, when their cells are not yet really able to use fat as a fuel, they feel pretty crappy. And generally, people push through that and they get what's called the keto flu and are at risk for becoming a little bit low in various types of minerals. So, again, caution would be making sure you're getting enough sodium, potassium, and magnesium.
We totally did go off script. I had 20 questions for you, and I was so interested in our off the record conversation that I wanted to just jump into all these new things that you have been talking about and been learning about. And I can't really now let you go without asking you about COVID and long COVID. You would, of course, be someone that would understand the effects on the brain and the body. I get tons of correspondence from people who have now long-term chronic illness from COVID, and obviously it's reactivating other infections and doing all kinds of damages. What do you think about long COVID, and do you have any strategies? People come to you and ask for help.
Yeah, and I think that I like to look at individuals suffering from long COVID through the lens of an acquired mitochondriopathy. I believe that, looking at cocktails of things that are worthwhile for the mitochondria, including creatine, coenzyme Q10, and hyperbaric oxygen therapy, are really the things that should be very, very strongly considered. One proposal recently that appeared in Neurology Reviews actually talked about giving individuals with long COVID metformin. Not to help them with blood sugar control, but because of the notion that metformin does enhance this notion of mitophagy and therefore mitochondrial biogenesis. I wonder if rapamycin might not be a good thing to try in long COVID. Who knows if something like that's going to happen, but I think the more we tend to focus on mitochondria, the better we will see the immune function become, and the better then downstream effects we might have in terms of ridding the body of any residual viral particles that may also be involved in the long-term consequences.
Can you take us through a day in the life of your healthy habits? You always seem so vital. Every time I've spoken to you and had a one-on-one where I can see you, I think, what is he doing? So
That's
I have
to ask,
what's the secret?
Well, I exercise every day. I lift weights every other day and do aerobics most days. This morning, I've had a lot to do, but I did get in a 2-mile run and some yoga. We had a 20-minute meditation first thing. I did have something to eat around noon, which was chopped up beets and then this thing called Florida salad, which is mostly cruciferous vegetables. And on top of that was olive oil. I've had 2 cups of coffee, one with macadamia in the frother, and a teaspoon of RX sugar, allulose. And the second one was more recently an espresso black with a teaspoon of allulose.
Are you careful about always eating organic or as much as possible?
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, we are really lucky. Within 3 blocks of our house is a local health food store, and it's militantly organic is what they say outside. So that's great. And but we get each week a box of organic vegetables from a local farm, and then there are farmers markets where we live on Tuesday and Saturday. So we go there. There are a couple of friends that we have that grow and bring their things there. We get to bed early, probably, oftentimes 9 o'clock. And we have one good meal a day, and that's usually around 5:30. And it's mostly plant-based, though we do eat some salmon, occasional red meat, but not much. And that's my lifestyle in a nutshell.
Do you drink wine?
Very minimally. More in the past, but I think, I think I can make up for the good things in wine by not actually drinking alcohol, which is a neurotoxin. I think, the upsides of wine were based on some of the components that I think I'm likely getting elsewhere.
Yeah.
I drink myself a liter of olive oil each week. So I'm
Ah,
getting lots of polyphenols there. And man, we get so many colorful vegetables from the various sources.
where can people find your talks, all of your information? Where can we find more about you and read your books?
So Dr. Perlmutter, drperlmutter.com, oddly enough, is my website. David Perlmutter, I think, on Instagram. The podcast is called The Empowering Neurologist.
Mhm.
And people can watch that on YouTube, Apple, all of the outlets, I guess, Spotify, listen. And I think probably the website's a great place to start.
I agree. Well, thank you so much. I have now to go back to my 20 questions next time we talk.
Okay.
But this has been fascinating and so much fun, and I'm honored that you took the time.
Oh, and I am too. Great to see you, and I'm looking forward to next time.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Tictective, a program of the Bay Area Lyme Foundation. For more information or to get involved, please visit us at bayarealyme.org.